Welcome to Math 154 videos. This video is going to be discussing the quotient rule, which I have written right here. If we have f over g and we're going to take the derivative of that, we need to do g times the derivative of f minus f times the derivative of g all over g squared. And sometimes we write that as high over low. So we have f is our high function, g is our low function, and then we remember it by low d high, so low times the derivative of high, that's what low d high means, minus high d low, so the top and the derivative of the bottom, all over low squared. So low d high minus high d low over low squared. So that's a little trick you can use to help you remember the quotient rule, because since we have subtraction in the numerator here, the order in which we put things is going to make a big difference. So let's move on to our example. We have y equals e to the x over 1 plus x squared, and we're going to take the derivative with the quotient rule. So then we get y prime is equal to, so e to the x is our high function and 1 plus x squared is our low function. So we're first going to do low d high. So our low function is 1 plus x squared. Then d high, the derivative of e to the x is just e to the x. We're multiplying them together. So we have 1 plus x squared times e to the x. Alright. Then minus our high d low. So our high is e to the x. And our d low, well, 1 plus x squared, the derivative of that is just 2x, right? We move the 2 in front, decrease the power by 1, that's the power rule, and we get a 2x. And then that whole thing has to be put over low squared. So our bottom here was 1 plus x squared, and then we just have to square the whole thing. Alright. Now there's a little bit of simplification we can do. In the numerator here we can pull out an e to the x. So why don't we go ahead and do that, and we're left with a 1 plus x squared, and then we have subtracted from that a 2x. From this last term here, when we pull out e to the x, we get a minus 2x. So minus a 2x, and then that whole thing is going to be over 1 plus x squared, and then that whole thing is squared. Alright, now we can do one more little thing. We have an e to the x, the whole thing over a 1 plus x squared, and now we notice that this numerator here, the rest of it, if we rewrite this as an x squared minus a 2x plus 1, we can certainly factor that, and we're going to get an x minus 1 squared. So that simplifies a bit. Now the denominator here, if we were to expand that out, it would just look less simplified. We want to just leave it in this nice looking form here. We don't want to touch the denominator because nothing at this point is going to cancel out, so we're good. That is going to be our final derivative using the quotient rule. So here's our second example, and this one's going to get a little bit more complicated, and I'll show you why. The problem is this numerator here, if we look at this, our function f, or our high function, that is actually the product of two functions. So we need to be a little bit careful. So right here, I'm going to actually write out our f prime and our g prime so we can be a little bit more organized. And if it helps you to do this first and then plug it all back into the formula, that might be actually a good option. So I'm going to label this denominator here g. We have f and g, and now f prime and g prime. So f prime we need to do using the product rule. So what is that going to be? Well, we're going to take the derivative of the first term, x, So the derivative of that is just 1, and we're going to multiply it by e to the x. So there we have it. Then we are going to add to it the first term, which is x. Then the derivative of e to the x is just e to the x. So we get e to the x plus x e to the x. Okay. Then what we can do is take the derivative of the bottom. So we're going to get 2x from that x squared. We take the derivative, that becomes 2x, and then plus a 4. Now we're a little bit in better shape to apply the quotient rule here because we already have our f prime and our g prime set up for us. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So now we get y prime, and that's by the quotient rule, is equal to, well, our low d high is first. That's g times f prime. So our g is x squared plus 4x, and then that's our low, so our d high is our f prime, which we know is e to the x plus x e to the x. Alright, then we have to subtract from it our high, which is our x e to the x, times our d low. And our d low we have right here, it's the derivative of g, so g prime, that's 2x plus 4. So we'll get x e to the x, that whole thing times 2x plus 4, all over our low squared, which is x squared plus 4x, that whole thing squared. Alright, so now we can go ahead and distribute out all of these things. So we'll go ahead and distribute this x squared there. So we'll get x squared e to the x, then plus an x cubed e to the x. Now we'll go ahead and distribute this 4x, so that will go to both terms as well. So we get plus a 4x e to the x plus a 4x squared e to the x. And now we'll subtract from it this whole quantity distributed out there. So we're going to subtract from it an x e to the x times 2x, which is going to be a 2x squared e to the x. Alright. Then there's a minus out here. Don't forget that. So we're going to subtract from it this x e to the x plus 4. So that's going to be 4x e to the x. Okay. That negative comes from this negative way out here, and this 4 was positive, so we get a negative there. Alright, so now we're going to have to look for things to cancel out. So there's, well, don't forget about your x squared plus 4x, whole thing squared down here, but we don't really need to worry about that yet. So we have a 4x e to the x there and a 4x e to the x here. One's subtracted, so those two are going to cancel out. And looking at this, there's not really anything else that's going to cancel out, but we have an x squared e to the x here. We have a 4x squared e to the x here, and minus a 2x squared e to the x here. So that's 4 plus 1, that's 5 minus 2 is 3. So that's actually going to simplify to 3x squared e to the x. And then left over we have this x cubed e to the x, so we're going to add that. And then that whole thing is over our x squared plus 4x, whole quantity squared. And one last thing we can do is we can pull out an e to the x and an x squared. So we'll go ahead and do that. So we'll pull out x squared e to the x. Then what do we have left over in the first term? Just a 3. And then we have plus an x there. So when we pull out an x squared, we're left with just an x. And there's an e to the x, so that checks out okay. And then we have all of that over x squared plus 4x, that whole thing squared, and that is equal to ry prime, our derivative, by the quotient rule.